What if I told you that the document everyone thinks they know was actually written by a man who owned over 600 human beings? And the most famous phrase in it wasn't even supposed to be there. The Declaration of Independence, 4 pieces of parchment, 56 signatures, 1,323 words that somehow convinced 13 weak colonies to go to war against the most powerful empire on earth. But here's what nobody tells you about this document. The version you learned about in school? That's not the real story. The truth is so much stranger, so much messier, and honestly, so much more human than anything you've been taught. Let me take you back to June 1776. Philadelphia is burning hot. I mean the kind of heat where your clothes stick to your skin and flies swarm everywhere because there's no sanitation. The Second Continental Congress is meeting in a building that reeks of sweat and horsehair wigs. These men have been arguing for weeks. They're tired, they're scared, and they have every reason to be. Think about their situation for a second. They're about to declare war on Britain. Not just any Britain. The Britain that has the largest navy in the world. The Britain that crushed the Spanish Armada. The Britain that controls a quarter of the known world. And what do these colonies have? Farmers with muskets, a few cannons, some angry merchants. That's it. But the real problem isn't military. It's legal. See, in 1776, there's no such thing as a country just deciding to exist. That's not how the world works. Every piece of land belongs to someone. Every government has divine authority or hereditary right or military conquest behind it. The idea that people can just vote to create a new country? That's insane. That's chaos. That's asking for every peasant in Europe to start thinking they don't need kings. So these men in Philadelphia need to do something impossible. They need to write a document that justifies rebellion. Not just to themselves, not just to the colonists who are still on the fence, but to France, to Spain, to the Netherlands, to every country they hope will give them money and weapons and ships. They need to convince the world that they're not traitors, they're not criminals, they're not crazy. They need to explain why it's okay to tear apart the natural order of things, and they have about 3 weeks to do it. The Continental Congress picks 5 men for this job. Benjamin Franklin, who at 70 is basically ancient and suffering from gout so bad he can barely walk. John Adams, who never shuts up and has opinions about everything. Roger Sherman, who looks like an undertaker and has the personality to match. Robert Livingston, who's rich and connected but will end up not even signing the thing. And Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson is 33 years old. He's tall, like really tall for that time, around 6'2". He has red hair that he powders white because that's the fashion. He doesn't like public speaking. Actually, he hates it. In all his years in Congress, people will say his voice was heard maybe once or twice. He mumbles. He's awkward. But the man can write. Adams pushes hard for Jefferson to draft the Declaration. Later, Adams will write about this moment. He'll say Jefferson had a happy talent for composition and a remarkable felicity of expression. That's fancy old-timey talk for the guy's good with words. But there's another reason Adams wants Jefferson to do it. Adams is from Massachusetts. Everyone already thinks Massachusetts is pushing for independence. If Adams writes this document, people will say it's just more northern aggression. But Jefferson, he's from Virginia, the largest, richest, most important colony. If Virginia is on board, everyone else will follow. So Jefferson agrees, and he goes back to his rented room in a house on Market Street. Actually, it's not even a whole house. It's 2 rooms on the 2nd floor, 1 bedroom, 1 parlor. That's where he's going to write the words that change everything. But here's what you need to understand about Jefferson in this moment. He doesn't want to be in Philadelphia. His wife, Martha, is back in Virginia. She's been sick. She's had multiple miscarriages. Their infant daughter just died a few months ago. Jefferson is worried sick about her. He keeps writing letters, begging to be allowed to go home. He feels trapped in this hot, stinking city, doing work he never asked for. And yet somehow, from this place of frustration and homesickness and grief, He's going to write something that still makes people cry 250 years later. Jefferson sits down at a portable writing desk he designed himself. It's this clever little box that opens up into a slanted surface. He uses a quill pen, not like a nice smooth ballpoint. We're talking about a sharpened bird feather that he has to keep dipping in ink every few words. The ink is made from oak galls and iron sulfate. It's thick and it smells bad. One scratch too hard and the paper tears. Too light and the words don't show up. He doesn't write on regular paper either. He uses special Dutch paper that costs a fortune, but he goes through it fast because he's constantly revising, crossing things out, rewriting. He's a perfectionist. Every word has to be exactly right. Now here's where it gets interesting. Jefferson doesn't come up with this stuff from nowhere. He's borrowing, heavily. He's got books stacked around him. Works by John Locke, the English philosopher who wrote about natural rights and government by consent. George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was written just a few weeks earlier. His own draft of the Virginia Constitution, stuff he wrote as a young lawyer arguing cases. The most famous line in the Declaration, the one everyone knows, "All men are created equal?" That's directly from George Mason, who wrote, "All men are by nature equally free and independent." Jefferson just smooths it out, makes it flow better. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But wait. The first draft doesn't say self-evident. It says sacred and undeniable. Franklin changes it. He crosses out Jefferson's words and writes self-evident instead. Why? Because sacred is religious. It's appealing to God. But self-evident is rational. It's saying this is obvious to anyone who thinks about it. You don't need faith, you just need logic. That's the Enlightenment right there. That's the whole thing they're trying to do. Move away from divine right and toward reason. And pursuit of happiness? That's Jefferson changing Locke. Locke wrote about life, liberty, and property. Everyone in the 18th century knows that trio. It's basically the foundation of English rights. But Jefferson swaps out property for pursuit of happiness. Some people think this is because he doesn't want to protect slavery, which is property. Others think it's because he's read Scottish philosophers who write about happiness as a moral goal. Honestly, we don't know exactly why. Jefferson never explains it, but that one-word change creates something new, something that will make people argue for centuries about what happiness means and who gets to pursue it. Jefferson writes for 17 days, not straight through. He's still going to congressional sessions every day, still eating meals, still writing those letters to Martha. But whenever he has a moment, he's scratching away with that quill, writing, crossing out, rewriting. Finally, he has a draft. He shows it to Adams and Franklin first. They make changes. Franklin makes a lot of changes. He's a printer by trade. He knows how words work, how they sound when you read them out loud. He tightens Jefferson's prose, cuts unnecessary words, makes it punchy. Adams makes fewer edits, but they matter. He's thinking about the legal argument, about how this will sound to foreign courts. He adds a bit here, removes a bit there. Then the draft goes to the full Congress, and this is where Jefferson's heart breaks. The Congress rips it apart. For 2.5 days, from July 2nd to July 4th, the delegates go through the Declaration line by line. They argue about every phrase. They cut huge sections. Jefferson sits there in agony. Later, he'll describe it as mutilations of his work. He's watching his carefully crafted document get shredded by a bunch of lawyers and merchants who think they know better. Adams sits next to him and whispers encouragements. Franklin tells him a story about a hat maker who kept asking friends for advice on his sign until there was nothing left but his name and a picture of a hat. It's meant to make Jefferson feel better. It doesn't work. The biggest cut? Almost 400 words about slavery. Jefferson wrote this long, passionate paragraph blaming King George for the slave trade. He calls it cruel war against human nature itself. He talks about how the king has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. It's powerful stuff. It's also completely hypocritical because Jefferson owns slaves, lots of them. And he knows it, but he writes it anyway because he needs someone to blame. He needs the document to say that slavery is bad without saying that the men signing this document are doing something bad. The Congress cuts it, all of it. South Carolina refuses to sign if it stays in. Georgia backs them up. Even some northern delegates don't like it because they're making money from the slave trade. Ships from Massachusetts and Rhode Island are carrying human beings across the Atlantic right now. Those delegates don't want this document to call their business a crime against humanity. So it goes. Deleted. Jefferson is furious. He'll bring this up for the rest of his life. He'll tell anyone who listens that he wanted to end slavery, but Congress stopped him, which is a lie. He never wanted to end slavery. He wanted to blame someone else for it. But the lie works. People will believe for decades that Jefferson was secretly an abolitionist whose noble efforts were crushed by evil slaveholders. Congress makes other cuts too. They remove flowery language, references to British people as friends who didn't help, anything that sounds too angry or too poetic. They want this document to be sharp, direct, undeniable. What's left is about 1,323 words, roughly a quarter shorter than what Jefferson wrote. But somehow, through all the cutting and arguing and compromising, it still works. Maybe it works better. Because now it's not just Jefferson's voice, it's the voice of 56 men who are about to bet their lives on these words. On July 4th, 1776, Congress approves the final draft. But here's something most people don't know. They don't all sign it on July 4th. That's a myth. On that day, only John Hancock, the President of Congress, and Charles Thompson, the Secretary, sign it. Everyone else signs later, some as late as August. A few never sign at all. The document that gets approved on July 4th isn't even the one people remember. It's ordered to be printed and distributed. A printer named John Dunlap works through the night. He sets the type by hand, letter by letter. He prints about 200 copies on a single large sheet of paper. These become known as the Dunlap broadsides. Only 26 survive today. Each one is worth millions. These broadsides go out on horseback, to the 13 colonies, to the Continental Army, to town squares where they're read aloud to crowds. And this is when it becomes real, when ordinary people, not just politicians, hear these words. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. The famous version, the one with all 56 signatures, doesn't get made until August. It's hand-copied onto parchment by Timothy Matlack, who has beautiful handwriting. That's the one they all sign. That's the one that survives. That's the one tourists look at in the National Archives, so faded now you can barely read it. But what makes this document actually change the world isn't the signing. It's what happens next. See, declarations are easy. Anyone can write down that they're independent. The hard part is making other people believe it. And in July 1776, almost nobody believes it. The British certainly don't. They think this is a bunch of rebels who will be hanged by Christmas. Most Europeans think the same thing. Even many Americans aren't sure. Loyalists make up maybe a third of the colonial population. They think this declaration is treason. They think the people who signed it should be executed. And legally they're right. This is treason. The punishment for treason is being hanged until you're almost dead, then cut down and disemboweled while you're still alive, then chopped into pieces. That's not an exaggeration. That's literally what British law says happens to traitors. Every man who signs the Declaration knows this. John Hancock supposedly says, "We must all hang together," and Franklin replies, "Yes, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." It might be made up, but it captures the moment. These men are signing their death warrants. So how does this document, written by a homesick plantation owner who copied most of his ideas from other people, actually change anything? It changes things because it makes a philosophical argument that most people in 1776 have never heard before. It says that governments exist to protect rights, not to grant them, not to give them as gifts, to protect them, because rights come from being human. They're not permissions from a king. They're not privileges you earn. They're built into existence itself. This is radical. This is dangerous. Because if rights come from being human, then everyone has them. Not just property owners, not just white men, not just Christians, everyone. The document doesn't say that out loud. It won't be interpreted that way for a long time. But the logic is there, waiting. The Declaration also does something sneaky. It lists 27 grievances against King George. Most people skip this part. It's long and boring, stuff about taxes and judges and quartering soldiers. But this list serves a purpose. It shows that the colonists didn't just wake up one day and decide to rebel. They tried, they petitioned, they begged, they gave the king every chance to fix things, and he refused. So now, rebellion isn't just justified, it's necessary. It's the only option left. This matters for foreign relations. France is watching. Spain is watching. The Netherlands is watching. They all hate Britain. They'd love to see Britain lose these colonies. But they're not going to help a bunch of lawless rebels. They need to see a legitimate government with legitimate grievances making a legitimate case. The Declaration gives them that. It's not a temper tantrum. It's a legal brief. Within a few months, foreign aid starts coming. Money from France, weapons from Spain, loans from Dutch banks. Without that help, the revolution fails. Washington's army starves or freezes or just goes home. But the Declaration makes it possible for other countries to help without looking like they're just causing chaos. The Declaration also creates a new problem that Americans are still dealing with. It promises equality. All men are created equal, but it doesn't deliver, not even close. Slavery continues. Women can't vote. Poor white men in many states can't vote either. Native Americans definitely can't vote. And anyway, the Declaration calls them merciless Indian savages in one of those grievances. So you have this document that says one thing and a country that does another. That gap, that hypocrisy, that broken promise becomes the driving force of American history. Every reform movement, every expansion of rights, every protest and march and sit-in and lawsuit, they all point back to these words. You said all men are created equal. Prove it. Show us. Abolitionists in the 1800s quote the Declaration. Frederick Douglass builds entire speeches around it. He says the 4th of July is a mockery while slavery exists. But the Declaration itself is on his side. The document promises what the country refuses to deliver. Suffragettes in the early 1900s do the same thing. They hold up the Declaration and say, we're people too. These rights apply to us too. When they're arrested for protesting, they quote Jefferson in court. Civil rights activists in the 1960s invoke it constantly. Martin Luther King Jr.'s most famous speech talks about a promissory note that America gave to all its citizens. He's talking about the Declaration. He's saying the country made a promise and needs to keep it. Even today, immigrants point to the Declaration. They say these aren't American rights. They're human rights. The document says so. If rights come from the Creator, not from the government, then it doesn't matter what country you're from, you have them. This is the power of what Jefferson wrote. Not that it made everything perfect immediately, but that it created a standard, a measuring stick, a way to say, this is what we're supposed to be, this is what we claimed, now live up to it. The physical document, the actual parchment with the signatures, has its own wild story. It moves around constantly during the Revolution. Anytime the British get close, someone grabs it and runs. It spends time in Pennsylvania, then Baltimore, then back to Philadelphia. After the war, it goes to New York when that's the capital, then to Washington, D.C. when the capital moves. For most of the 1800s, it hangs on a wall in the patent office, just hanging there. Sunlight hitting it every day, fading it, damaging it. People don't realize what light does to ink and parchment. By the time someone thinks to protect it, huge amounts of text are already illegible. In 1921, it goes to the Library of Congress. They put it in a special case with gelatin filters to block damaging light. But it's already in bad shape. In 1952, they move it again, this time to the National Archives, where it stays. It's in a titanium and glass case filled with inert argon gas. The case is bomb-proof. It can sink underground in seconds if there's an attack. After 9/11, they tested the system. Worked perfectly. But even with all that protection, the document is dying. Ink is cracking. Parchment is yellowing. In another 100 years, it might be completely unreadable, which is ironic. The words that launched a nation are disappearing while the nation continues. The Declaration influences other countries, too. When France has its revolution in 1789, they write a Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. It's basically the American Declaration, plus equality and popular sovereignty. When Latin American colonies break free from Spain in the early 1800s, they cite the American Declaration. When Vietnamese nationalist Ho Chi Minh declares independence from France in 1945, he quotes Jefferson, word for word. All men are created equal. Even places that hate America use this document. Because the ideas in it don't belong to America. They belong to anyone fighting against tyranny, anyone saying that people should rule themselves, anyone arguing that rights are universal, not privileges granted by the powerful. Of course, the document has critics, lots of them. Some people point out that natural rights are a fiction. Rights don't exist in nature. Lions don't respect your right to life. Diseases don't care about your pursuit of happiness. Rights are a social construct, something humans invented and humans enforce. Without government, without society, without people agreeing to recognize them, rights are just words. Other critics focus on the contradictions. How can you write, all men are created equal, while owning slaves? How can you talk about liberty while stealing land from Native Americans? The men who signed this document weren't saints. They were politicians, ambitious, flawed, complicated people, doing what they thought would benefit themselves and their class. And some critics, especially modern ones, argue that the Declaration is too individualistic. It focuses on individual rights and doesn't say anything about community responsibilities, about taking care of each other, about collective welfare. It's very me-focused. My rights, my liberty, my pursuit of happiness. What about our society, our future, our obligations to each other? These are fair criticisms. The Declaration isn't perfect. It wasn't meant to be. It was written in 3 weeks by exhausted men trying to justify a war they weren't sure they could win. They were writing for their moment, their crisis, their specific problem. The fact that it speaks to people centuries later is almost an accident. But that's also what makes it powerful. Because it's not a detailed policy document. It's not a constitution laying out exactly how government works. It's a statement of principles. And principles can be interpreted. They can grow. They can adapt to new situations and new problems. When the document says, all men, people in 1776 think it means white male property owners. But the words don't say that. So later generations read the same words and say, no, it means all men, literally all. Then even later generations say, it says men, but it means people, all humans. The words stay the same, but the meaning expands. This is why totalitarian governments hate the Declaration, not because of what America does or doesn't do, but because of what the document says. It says that authority comes from the people, not from the government, that governments can be changed or abolished if they stop serving the people, that individuals matter, that rights exist independent of the state. For a dictator, this is poison. This is the most dangerous idea possible, because if people believe it, they won't obey. They'll resist. They'll fight. So countries like the Soviet Union, like China, like North Korea, they can't allow their citizens to read this document. Or if they do read it, it has to be presented as American propaganda, American hypocrisy. Look what they say but don't do. Which is fair. America often doesn't live up to the Declaration. But that doesn't make the words less true. It makes America's failure more obvious. There's a story, maybe true, maybe not, about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in their old age. They've been friends, then enemies, then friends again. They write letters constantly, long philosophical letters about history and government and ideas. In 1826, approaching the 50th anniversary of the Declaration, both men are dying. Jefferson goes first on July 4th. His last words are supposedly, "Is it the 4th?" He wants to make it to the anniversary. He does, barely. Adams dies the same day, a few hours later. His last words are supposedly, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He doesn't know his friend is already gone, but in a way, Adams is right. Jefferson survives, not the man, the words, the ideas. The Declaration of Independence isn't just a historical document. It's a living thing. It changes meaning as the world changes. It challenges every generation to ask, are we living up to this? Are we treating people equally? Are we protecting rights? Are we letting people pursue happiness? Most of the time the answer is no, but the asking matters, the standard matters, the promise matters. 56 men signed their names on that parchment. 9 of them died during the war. Several lost their fortunes. Thomas Nelson Jr. had his home destroyed by cannon fire during the Battle of Yorktown. He told the American gunners to fire on it because British officers were inside. Richard Stockton was captured and tortured so badly he never recovered. Francis Lewis had his home burned and his wife imprisoned. She died from the treatment she received. These men knew what they were risking. They signed anyway, not because they were heroes, but because they thought the risk was worth it. They thought the idea of self-government, of rights, of equality, was important enough to die for. Were they right? That's for you to decide. America exists. It's powerful. It's flawed. It's complicated. The country built on this document has done terrible things and amazing things, often at the same time. It's freed people and enslaved people. It's spread democracy and crushed it. It's fought for human rights and violated them. But the document itself, the Declaration of Independence, those 1,323 words, they still ask the same question they asked in 1776. What do people deserve just for being people? What rights are so fundamental that no government can take them away? And what do you do when the government tries? Jefferson wrote in a letter years later that he didn't try to be original. He wasn't trying to invent new ideas. He was trying to capture what Americans already believed, to put into words the common sense of the matter. If he succeeded, it's because he listened. He read what other people wrote. He paid attention to the arguments happening around him, and then he synthesized it all into something clear and powerful. The desk he wrote it on still exists. It's in the Smithsonian. It's small, portable, the kind of thing you could carry from room to room or pack for a trip. Jefferson gave it to his granddaughter, and she passed it down until eventually it ended up in a museum. People sometimes go to see it, this ordinary wooden box that held the paper where someone wrote words that changed the world. That's the thing about the Declaration. It's monumental and it's mundane. It's this sacred text that tourists line up to see, but it was written by a tired, homesick lawyer who just wanted to go home to his sick wife. It promises equality, but was written by a slave owner. It talks about rights that most people in 1776 didn't have, and most people in 2025 are still fighting for. It's a contradiction. It's a challenge. It's a promise that's never been fully kept. And maybe that's exactly what makes it so powerful. Because if the promise were already fulfilled, if equality were already achieved, if all rights were already protected, then the document would just be history. Something to look at and say, that's nice, we did that. But we haven't done that. Not fully. So the Declaration stays alive. It stays relevant. Every time someone fights for their rights, they're continuing the argument that started in that hot room in Philadelphia. Every time someone says, I'm equal to you, I deserve the same treatment, the same opportunities, the same respect, they're quoting Jefferson, whether they know it or not. The words that changed the world weren't magic. They didn't make everything better overnight. They didn't solve problems or end injustice. What they did was create a framework, a way of thinking, a language for talking about rights and equality and government, and once that language exists, once those ideas are out there, you can't put them back. Kings tried, emperors tried, dictators tried. They burned copies of the Declaration. They banned it. They taught their people that American independence was a disaster, a cautionary tale, proof that democracy leads to chaos. But the ideas spread anyway, because the ideas make sense, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough that people risked their lives to spread them, enough that governments fell and new nations rose, enough that 250 years later we're still arguing about what those words mean and how to make them real. Closing recap. So that's the Declaration of Independence, not the myth, not the version from textbooks where heroic founders create a perfect document that launches a shining city on a hill, but the real version, written by flawed people who copied from other writers, cut apart by politicians worried about offending slave owners, approved almost by accident on a date most people don't realize was more symbolic than literal, spread by horseback and shipped to a skeptical world. And somehow, despite all that, maybe because of all that, it became the most influential political document in modern history. Not because it was perfect, but because it was perfectible, because it set a standard that every generation since has had to confront. These 56 men sweating in Philadelphia in 1776, betting their lives on words and ideas, created something bigger than they understood, something that would outlive them all, something that's still not finished. Because the work of making those words real, of actually creating a world where all people are equal and all people have rights, that work continues. It's your work now, whether you live in America or anywhere else, whether you agree with everything in the Declaration or nothing in it. The question it asks is still the question we face. What do people deserve, and what are you willing to do to make sure they get it? If this made you think differently about history, watch the next video where we explore what really happened next.